Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your kind attention. I'm glad to be back with you. And this time it's not to listen to my voice, but for me to celebrate the voices of these wonderful colleagues. And I'm so happy to make an introduction to this panel, which for me is the continuation of a conversation I've been privileged to be a part of. And I'm so thankful that you can join with us today. And also that we're here in person is so meaningful. We are also joined by a wonderful guest who's joining virtually. So please allow me to introduce a series of speakers in the first ever, as far as I know, Indigenous Perspectives panel here in this STM conference. And I'm first pleased to introduce Faumuina, Felolini, Maria Tafuna'i. And I'll ask her to also introduce herself in a minute in her own words. And her introduction includes highlighting she's a daughter of Malapeti Nivaga Mao from Samoa. And she also is the mother of Oliver and wife of Patrick. Her background includes areas such as media, journalism, and communications. And she is also a voyager. And you'll hear about the Flying Geese projects and her experiences with reclaiming and carrying on traditions of ocean voyaging. We'll hear more, as well as a piece from the recently published book entitled My Grandfather is a Canoe, which is a book of poetry. So pleased to have with us in person today, Dan Hawk. Welcome, Dan. We'll hear more from your background as well, but we appreciate you are representing today the Oneida Nation, and that you also have experience serving in the Army National Guard and the Navy, so thank you for that service. And one of the things I heard you say yesterday in summarizing your experience briefly is that one of your goals is to help Indigenous nations in the North American context get into space, and that you have experience doing this already, and that you have already had space missions and you have ongoing visions for missions. So we look forward to hearing about that. Also with us today in person is Jacqui Hoover. Thank you. We're happy to have you, and really appreciative of the other half of this kind of meeting. I feel as those who gather regularly in Maui for the AMOS conference, and just appreciating your organization and the efforts of both at the Maui level and the Hawaii level, the Economic Development Board that sees engagement with the space community as a key part of your work. So you're president of the Hawaii Libra Planning Conference, and is also serving in a role through the Hawaii Economic Development Board. So we look forward to hearing your personal introduction, but also appreciate your professional roles and the roles that you play to help connect technology-oriented industries to Hawaii. Thank you so much. Our goal today is to ask our guests a few questions to help us get to know them better, but also just to listen, and to listen to things that hopefully will be helping you think about things a little differently. I'd like to ask now, I have done my best as a moderator to do introductions, but really that means very little, because what I've asked each person to do is consider, please tell us more about who you are, but in your own words, including any language you prefer to speak in, because my ability is limited. I'd like to see if Faumuina is ready to go. Faumuina, can we do a quick check with you and hear your voice?
Good morning, Danielle.
Hello, we hear you well. Thank you so much. May I ask you to go first to introduce yourself to us, and please use any words or language you prefer.
Ia malola soifo malalangi mau e maua, malola mana, malola fo'i tātou mafutanga nenei aso, whaftalia to e tātou mafutanga. In my language, that's in Samoan, I'm just going to also speak in Te Reo Māori, which is the language of the people whose land I'm standing on. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi ki te atua, tēnei te mihi ki ngā rangatira kei konei. Ka nui te koa tēnā kai ki te kiti a koutou, ki te tū, kotahi a tātou mō tēnei kaupapa, kia ora. So my name is Faumuina, Felolini Maria Tafuna'i, and so I'm a Samoan, first generation proud immigrant, and living in Aotearoa. I usually bounce between Samoa and Aotearoa. I guess for me, I feel like a daughter of the moana. So a lot of my life has been lived around the islands of the Pacific. Feel very privileged in that space to learn about all of my kin, of the Pacific, because often we've been separated by colonization and by the language of the colonizers, whether that be French or English, and had those connections both on water by voyaging and then also on land. And currently I'm in Christchurch. I'm also the founder and CEO of Flying Geese, which is a company that does all our work through a voyaging and celestial navigation framework. So we've transposed what we do out there on the water and brought it into all of our projects on land. Now I see, Danielle, that because you mentioned my grandfather as a canoe, I just want to take this brief little time. I'm just going to share with you a poem from there that may, I guess, help us understand our place in the universe. This one's called Etu Iti, which is the Rarotongan word for little star. Etu Iti, I'm taking your sister out of the sky to hold her in my hand and show my son. He watches you with saucers in his eyes, wide-eyed, tracing your whakapapa lines across the black, black skies far from earth. Your sister, she is burning a hole in my flesh. It melts while I am caught in her trance. This tiny star, Etu Iti, is a cosmic gift, light that was sent thousands of years ago when only Papuans and Yakunchara Aborigines were trekking in highlands and deserts. Etu Iti, where have you been? What sees you? Who have you guided home or led astray with your heavenly rise and rhythmic fall? Whose constellation do you play with in the solstice? Tautoru, Matali'i, Te Matau a Maui, are they your playmates? Or do you instead prefer to follow the ocean tides and swells, watch the people with their busy, busy lives, always looking down, feet on the ground? Kia ora.
So much. Thank you for that introduction and for sharing that poem. And already you pointed to us the connection to the stars with that introduction. Thank you. I'd like to turn to Jacqui next. Please, will you also tell us who you are?
Aloha mai kako. Greetings to us all, including those of you who are sharing this space with us by Zoom. I am Jacqui Hoover of multiple ethnicities, predominantly Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian, also Dene, Navajo, Tahitian, French, English, Irish, Scottish, Chinese. I was born and raised and am a resident of Mokuokeawe, the island of Hawaii, born to Kamuela Kahalealoa of Waipio Valley, the Valley of the Kings, Hamakua Apuaha, Mokuokeawe, island of Hawaii, and to Ululani of Wailukuahupua'a, Mokuopi'ilani, island of Maui. You will notice that I'm wearing a lei of maili, and maili is one of the traditional, most revered lei materials we have in Hawaii, in ancient times used for sacred ceremonies and to symbolize peace. And it's used in modern times for weddings, graduations, groundbreakings, other special occasions. Made from a vine-like shrub, it grows in the mountain rainforest. And whereas typically lei are bound together and form a garland, you'll notice that these are open-ended lei. And as we go through the day, I'll share with you why I chose this particular open-ended lei. So mahalo, thank you for including me.
Mahalo. Thank you, Dan. Please.
Okay, I'm Dan Hawk. I'm Oneida. I live on the Stockbridge Munson Reservation, Wisconsin. I am of the Iroquois Confederacy on Bear Clan. The Iroquois Confederacy consists of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. So.
Thank you. We're honored to know better where you come from and who your families are. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask all of you to comment, even if you're building on the introduction, What are some of the values within your community on the word that I will use in English of sustainability? And if you would like to propose a different word that is a closer fit to your definitions, please do. I'm thinking of this as part of the question of how we as humans engage with our natural environment, with each other, and with all that is, both living like animals and plants, but also the non-living, which I'm again saying in English, maybe it's even a useful term, but please reinterpret what I'm saying. But I'd love to ask, what are some of the values that you bring, both from your own personal value set, but also those from the broader community? Let's ask Jacqui to start.
So I had mentioned this lay, and it, on the starting and end, what I'll call is the beginning. And the starting point for me symbolizes our creation chant, the Kumulipo, which speaks of our origins, including the following lines. And these lines were translated by Larry Kimura, the University of Hawaii, who is a scholar of Olelo, our Hawaiian language. And his name may be familiar to some of you because he has also given names to some of the celestial bodies that we have discovered in recent times. So from our Kumulipo, our origin chant, these words come to us: when fundamental space altered through heat, when the cosmos altered, turning inside out, when the sun was flickering between darkness and light, attempting to brighten the moon, when this complete abyss was dotted with tiny stars, then began the slime that established a physical space, the source of impenetrable darkness, so profound, a fathomless power reincarnating itself. And I use this creation chant that we Hawaiians revere as the source of our origin because it speaks to me of the intersection between indigenous wisdom and contemporary astronomy and space exploration. And for me as a Native Hawaiian, it also helps to share my story of relationship and stewardship of the Aina, the land, Kai, the sea, and also of Lani, the space and heavens. And so it really speaks to me that in the context of this conference and our discussion today, that our Kumulipo is so relevant. So mahalo.
Our creation story starts with Skyward. Very emotional, but from the sustainability standpoint, I come from the relationship that talking about, but also in the way of taking indigenous people all over the world into space. So at a local level, Stockbridge Munson Reservation, Menominee Forest is right close by. I can throw a stone and hit it. So we have sustainability in the Menominee Sustainable Forest. So that is where I bring a lot of my background in sustainability. I'm Amazon Black Earth expert. So carbon is really my background, and so I'm pushing that out a little further now, so that I'm going into working with the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium with Johns Hopkins University. So we talk about things like being on a focus group for in situ resource utilization, for an example. So what are the indigenous views from Skywoman's point of view, taking it to the moon, and how we go to the moon and how we use and utilize resources on the moon that is sustainable, so that we, in the eyes of indigenous people, when we're extracting resources on the moon, how does that affect us? We have the International Lunar Research Station is going to be built in the moon in mid-latitudes, I believe. And so at some point in time, we're going to be seeing lights on the moon. So as indigenous people, we're going to walk out and we're going to look up at the moon and we're going to see lights. And that's going to change how we view our things about Skywoman, sustainability, what it's going to mean to our young, our next generation, our seventh generation, when we look up at the moon and we see lights from mining operations. I know that I am not going to be able to be, as an individual Native person working with Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium, to stop our world from going to the moon and extracting resources. But what I can do, from the indigenous point of view, is that I can go and I can say that when we take these resources, that we take them in a way that is respectful.
That. Thank you, Dan. We'll come back. But thank you so much. I want to also turn to Faumuina and ask you the same question and add the angle of, as you're sharing your thoughts on sustainability, please also add your culture's relationship to space, which you already connected to us a bit. Faumuina, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I think from a couple of things which resonate with me is, of course, the stewardship, kaitiakitanga, is strong in knowing that both that you don't own this, you know, there's no such thing as real kind of ownership. And I guess that's why it was very difficult during colonial times when settlement was happening, the idea that things could be fully owned. But actually, if we think about stewardship, what is that, and how we play our part in fulfilling and using the wisdom of our ancestors, but also that our future generations are already with us. And so if you're already acting in that way where your future generations are present, I think then you won't be so sort of draining of resources. You're not trying to use them up in your own generation. And so that's one of the things I think that we sort of carry about having this idea of time and that we're all here together. Or I'm sitting here already with my ancestors. I'm sitting here already with my future generations. And so the decisions I make actually are made with all of that in mind. Another part of us, I think, is that with the voyaging, that the sense or the knowledge that being connected to all things in the world, including the cosmos. And recently I'm just working on a museum project, and they wanted to show the voyages that we've been doing. And they put up these, you know, maps as we sort of used to seeing them, like the map of the world and that. But actually, we never, we don't look at those maps when we're sailing. We look to the sky. The sky is our map. So it was a real, I guess, for us, it was so normal that that's where we look to find out where we are. And then for the museum, they've had to go and change everything because, you know, we don't go around looking for tiny dots on the sea. We know that where we are by the rise and fall of stars and when certain patterns are in the stars before us. And I think knowing that, that we are all part of this, and I think it's that separateness and disconnection to the natural environment and to the space environment, which allows us to act in ways of, you know, polluting and not looking after that environment, and to not think also to disregard space as an environment. And whereas the way that we look at it is that we are all part of the same, I don't know, it's like being same part of the same molecule. We're all having a conversation. And right now, the conversation that space is trying to have with us is that, hey guys, you're making such a mess. And we can see that this human behavior we see on Earth is happening, you know, in space. And I think if we took that step back, what are we leaving for future generations? That's always present in our minds, rather than trying to make a fortune and leave behind a legacy of distraction.
Legacy of distraction, that is a poetic term from a poet. I just wanted to pause for a moment and say, for those who are not familiar with the tradition celestial navigation practiced by your people. Could you please briefly introduce the concept? And also, if I understand correctly, it's powerful that you're learning it in the sense that you're also maintaining this knowledge for generations to come, making sure it's not lost. Can you share a bit about that?
Sure. So celestial navigation is how, well, firstly, it's how my ancestors traversed the entire Pacific, 1/3 of the earth, and settled. And it's what it is when in practice is that there are star paths that we follow. So stars, just like the sun, as you all know, rise and set. And certain star paths lead us to different locations. So the one that comes from Tahiti to Aotearoa to New Zealand is Te Ara o Te Pahu. That's the star path that we follow. But it's not just the stars actually, because once you're, the stars are very consistent in their behavior. However, on the sea, with swells and currents and wind, that's a different thing. So you're also listening to what the sea is telling you. So different parts of the year, we know that there's the way the currents flow. We know that the trade winds, for example. So we're listening to that. We're listening to how the wind is, how that's blowing. And so what a navigator does is listen and sense all of these movements. So if you think the stars give us position, but then they have to actually work out how fast we're going. And also, do we need to go off course if the environment won't take us there? Because, it's no straight line sailing out there in the big blue. So there's, so it's very much, it's sort of hard to describe, but it's very much a listening exercise to the entire environment to know where you're going, but also listening to your canoe, the pressure and strain of your canoe, and listening to the capability and the strength, or the, if that's sort of variable within your crew as well. So that's what our celestial navigators are doing. And they weren't just navigators, they were builders of canoes, they were teachers of this. So when we think about that next generation, that they were teaching all of that. And the revival of celestial navigation at the moment, thanks to Maupio, who came from Satawal, who taught the Hawaiians, who taught Nainoa Thompson, and spread that around from the east, and then spread it back to the west side of the Pacific. So so it has been something that is now taught, and it's taught informally and formally. You can go to courses in it if you want to sit in a lecture room. You can also just be part of youth programs. You can be, and I think that's the strength of it. It's not held just in one place.
Thank you so much. That was really informative and beautiful. And I want to turn first to Dan and to Jacqui and ask you both, please talk about some of the work you have been doing with regard to both helping to advance space sustainability and also linking the visions, the aspirations of your communities and other Native peoples in space.
Okay, so SSR, right? So what is it that we are doing as Native people? First, we're having our first Intertribal Space Conference in Oklahoma at the spaceport, November 16th to 17th. So we're working on getting into space as an equal access to space issue. United Nations says that having equal access to space is a human right. This comes on the heels of the Torres Strait 8 lawsuit against Australia for not doing enough for climate change as their island nations are being flooded from sea level rise, inundated from sea level rise. So we know that one of the remedies is to have our Indigenous people have access to space to monitor resources or climate change and habitat change. So we are creating with Johns Hopkins University 2 satellites, two tribal government satellites. One is for ocean plastics mapping, And the other one is for permafrost loss prediction. There will be more, of course, but and we had talked last night as an example, something about, you know, SSR. So we are creating industrial hemp rocket fuel, using industrial hemp for 3D printed engines that are just robust enough so that it depletes the fuel. And so we're not having excess weight, but also having sustainability. Also, our frames will be out of industrial hemp parts. Our printed circuit boards are industrial hemp. So we talk about if we have to have an end of life procedure and we're just disposing of our satellite over the Pacific, that we have less pollution in our atmosphere. Furthermore, when we look at missions, we tend to want to launch low. So in other words, we launch low only so that we get the data that's necessary for the mission, so that we can deposit our satellites over the ocean and deposit it in a way that would be sustainable as best as we can. Maybe 225 kilometers as an example versus 160 of rapid descent. So those are the things that we're working on with satellites per se. And also, you know, going into space, we're bringing tribal leaders together for, you know, understanding how to have equal access to space, not only as far as tribal sovereignty, but our ability to have spaceports, being able to launch our own rockets. You know that I'm a part of the United First Nation Planetary Defense. I work with the University of California, Santa Barbara on planetary defense, 3 models. You know, laser ablation impactor and through what we call pulverized model, which I work on to basically, you know, blow asteroids up. So I get the best job ever. I get to blow up things. So that's the asteroid planetary defense model. And so, but part of that is our planetary defense and planetary protection of Earth. Again, we're back to ocean plastics mapping. So we, as tribal people, are looking at and a policy perspective. So 2 things. One, Office of Tribal Affairs in NASA. We're working towards that, getting the 53rd space grant, a national Native American space grant, in addition to the other 50 states and one for Puerto Rico and DC. So a national Native American space grant. So we're working on that. We're working on Office of Tribal Affairs, not only in NASA, but also in the Canadian Space Agency. United First Nations Planetary Defense is of both the nations of Treaty of 1794. So basically, that our First Nations people in Canada and our Native American people, Alaska Natives in the United States, were one people, one. We're not separate. We have 1,204 tribal governments, vast resources, a lot of talent pool, and a lot of money that NASA has basically said that was basically non-existent. That hurts. To continue, we talked about, Georgia talked about a 5-4 solution, right? Article 5.4, right? Some of the things that Native American people can do, right? So we look at something like a rescue mission. So what you probably don't understand, what you don't know about planetary defense is that we have with the Maori tribe in New Zealand, who has a launch capability, an electron rocket in their kick stage, right? We can do laser ablation, we can do impactor, we can also do the pulverizing method, but their rocket lab is setting aside for us an electron rocket with a kick stage. So if there is a need for planetary defense of asteroids, that they had that rocket set aside for us, but we would have to do the integration in the kick stage. It could also be, just by talking this morning, it could also be a 5-4 solution where you have the Maori tribe as an example, and the auspices of New Zealand and Artemis Accord to have electron rockets set aside. So if there is a conjunction event that is imminent, that needs some type of rescue, that electron rocket could be used to be able to do that. So I'm just throwing that out there. These are the things that I think about all the time, being able to try to understand how Indigenous people can come about and be a third party to Russia and China and India, and be able to say to them, you know, we're Indigenous people, you know, we don't have a part to play in understanding or wanting your technology for war, but what we want to do is we want to have space to be safe to be sustainable, for Indigenous perspective, our children going outside and being able to see space as it used to be 2 years ago.
Thank you so much, Dan. And for those who didn't catch it, I appreciate what you were saying about the space grant. For those who don't know, the US has programs in space, but also for sea. So universities around the country, one in each state typically, have an office to support education and training for students. You mentioned a need to go to 53. So all states, we have Puerto Rico, for example, there needs to be one you're saying for Native peoples. So thank you for that call for action. Thank you for all these. Wonderful. I'm going to turn to Jacqui. I'll just say after this, it's your turn. Please think about questions you have for our wonderful panelists. And toward the end, I'll ask you to all make closing comments on your recommendations, people working on space traffic management. And so I'll turn to Jacqui and ask you the same question. How are you working on advancing Native activities in space?
Okay, so I'm so glad that I have, for lack of a better word, a cousin from Samoa also representing Aotearoa and our Maori cousins, because we too have a tradition of wayfinding. And I think one of the contributions we're making in Hawaii is to utilize our traditions of wayfinding as we move into space. Woven into this lei I'm wearing is my own ohana, my family. And for us, the story includes names. Names are very important. So my older son, for example, is named Hokulea, after the star Hokulea, the star of joy, which some of you know that our voyaging canoe Hokulea has been one of the leaders in our traditional path of wayfinding, coming back to cultures across Polynesia. And Hokulea is actually, many of you know it as the star of tourists. It's important in our celestial navigation for traditional wayfinding. Our son named his son Hikianalia, which is named of the star Spica, and it's the sister star to Hokulea, also significant because together Hokulea and Spica break the horizon together at the latitude of the Hawaiian Islands. And our granddaughter is named aptly Kia'i'onahoku, guardian of the stars. So these names really reflect how important space, the heavens, stars, and planets are to us. And it's very important, I think, to know that just as we have woven together our Indigenous knowledge and understanding of the stars, waves, weather, and seabirds, for example, and the rising and setting positions of hundreds of stars, so too can we help with the wayfinding as we move further into space. And I guess I've been very fortunate in that I've been in my career able to work at the Pacific Missile Range facility, which has served as the launch facility for most of the things we send into space from Hawaii. And we're now looking at establishing additional launch facilities. Hawaii, as you all know, is at a very enviable latitude for launch. And so we're working on that, but perhaps even more importantly, when we talk about sustainability and colonization, is helping our traditions, helping you all learn our traditions so that we can, in my mind, and reconcile past and present without sacrificing the future. That's very important for those of us who come from Indigenous people where we have experienced colonization to the extent that we have. And so I'm very proud personally to be working with Morba Ja and others who are looking at how do we eliminate what we in Hawaii call opala, trash from the heavens. And unlike the popular movie title recently, Don't Look Up, Indigenous people always look up. And what we're seeing is those points in the heavens that we depend on to help us with our wayfinding And wayfinding is not just about canoe voyaging, it's also about how we traverse life and navigate our past, present, and future. As we look up in the heavens, this debris contributes to all of those reflections that change the heavens for us. So I'm very proud to be working alongside people who are looking at how do we get rid of that? How do we exclude that from happening? And for that, I'm grateful to all of you for all of the work you do in helping us to traverse the heavens in a way that we've learned from the mistakes of the past, and more importantly, learned from those Indigenous and other cultures that are able to offer us a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. It's fun that we didn't get into the details of looking at your bio, of your experience as a project manager, project engineer, working with the DoD, with NOAA, with others. So you bring a lot to our conversation today, and thank you for reminding us. And that was a lovely transition. Did you want to go again, Dan, before I open to the audience? You good? All right. You looked ready to speak, so I wanted to check in. We would like to open, and don't forget we have our amazing connection to Faumuina as well. A question will be open for any of our three panelists, and toward the end, we'll come back to them for closing comments. I see a hand in the back.
Yes, I have, actually, it's a twofold question, one for each of the panelists, is that as far as being able to monitor satellites using to monitor your lands and the cultural lands, is there any plans of monitoring how climate change is affecting the ocean levels of Indigenous peoples in the Pacific? And if so, what procedure, what steps are being taken for that? And next, with respect to the stars and being the history, as I understand, of navigating from the stars, is there any position being taken on all of the mega constellations that are now being planned for small sats and things which some people say can obscure such visual observations? Thank you.
I have the microphone. I guess I get to go first. Okay, so in the first question about sea level rise, our first federal government satellite with permafrost loss prediction will have the ability to monitor glaciers, because that's the intent of the satellite, is to look at the permafrost loss at the line of demarcation between 32 and 33 degrees, and be able to add an NDVI index to that so that we can check vegetation. But that line of demarcation of 32, 33 degrees can also be used in glacier situations. And there we can look at what we call the rate of change of that line of demarcation between 32 and 33 degrees Fahrenheit. There then would be able to determine the amount of loss based on water as compared to ice, as an example. So we know, and I worked with, if you were to look at my website, you know that I worked with the Marshallese people, the Bikini Atoll, after the 69 nuclear detonations. They asked if I could help them with mitigating radiocesium-137 so they could eat their bananas and coconuts radioactive free. So that pyrogenic carbon was introduced into the island. I made 1 ton of pyrogenic carbon to be able to provide Bikini Atoll to the Department of Interior, Department of Energy, and Morris Livermore National Laboratory to mitigate that radiocesium-137 so the plants can grow radioactive free. It's an indigenous solution. But what I wanted to point out was that Bikini Atoll is only 3 meters above sea level. So here I am, creating a solution, and eventually Bikini Atoll may not even exist anymore because of sea level rise. So I'm very attuned to that. The other one about the stars and being able to walk outside and seeing the stars in the heavens and the moon it has changed. We'll never have that again in ancient days before Sputnik. It's just not going to happen. What we can do is we can look at a sustainability model from indigenous perspective through the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, I can call it, to have the space industry, right, work with indigenous people on how to go about doing things in space. Working together would have prevented things like the TMT, the 30-meter telescope in Mauna Kea. So I think that working together with indigenous people is a starting point for working on sustainability of the space. Space traffic management is one of those things. You should invite us and use us. I hate to say use us, indigenous people, for finding solutions like a 5-4 solution and being able to mitigate space debris, or to be able to find ways to, knowing that there is space debris, to perhaps seek tribal leadership position on what to do and how they can help, whether it's financial, whether it's through resources, because we are all in this together. This is a global issue. We do exist. We're people.
Oh, Faumuina. Danielle is asking for you to comment next. She doesn't have a mic, that's why I'm.
Thank you. Like in regards to climate change, I mean, in the islands, that's a very big conversation, and it's one that even you'll find school children in the Pacific Islands know more about climate change than probably a lot of politicians sitting in Aotearoa. It's from different perspectives. Yes, we have really active, family of meteorologists and quite a lot of assistance that comes from different monitoring agencies, but also that, we just generational stories of being able to pair that with what our land used to look like and where the shoreline used to be, and what is different about, say, the king tides in Tuvalu now, and that when waves are able to wash over an entire island. So I think there's a thing that we can use science for, but there's also, our people have been using observational science in generations and passing on those stories. And so those are the things, and I think I appreciate hearing, the greater context, and the glacier that does definitely help that. I think also when you're living in a smaller system, it also helps to know what existed before, and also what are you able to do. And I have to say, the other part that was that huge lobbying with every COP that there's been, and at huge expense to the islands, to get climate change, I guess, international agreement on that. And that's where a lot of that has, there's been a huge push for that, but we're very small voices. And, and it's one where when we talk about kaitiakitanga, that unless nations show full responsibility for what they're doing, that's going to be the pattern that we keep observing, we keep lobbying. And, so I just think that that's part of how do we change that story? I think that's one of the challenges. And just, there was a second part to that question now that I'm just a little bit, what was that?
Land. Our
Land.
Land. LAND, our traditional lands.
Oh, sorry. So that traditional lands, I've sort of lost that thread there.
I think you did perfectly. We're a little short on time, so I think your answer was wonderful. But thank you so
Okay.
much. We'll take another question and then prepare for closing time. We have one here.
Hi, Jacqui. Hi, Dan. Hi, Faumuina. I'm Mark from the state of New York, Panelists, live many places, including Tafuna'i on road. And my background is astronomy, and I've had the privilege of working in some very special places, which are also very sacred places. The House of the Sun, Palakwa, the Poriba, as well as on Mauna Kea. Astronomers, I think, we do exploration, we do planetary defense. I've worked in those pan-stars, as well as sustainability, understanding where the Apollo is. But we also want to move what's Pono. And I know there's lots of discord in some sectors, and it gives one grievance. And how can new arrivals that are trying to do things in astronomy work together with this? That's, I think, a thing for all three of you, but maybe for you, Jacqui.
Great. So Mark, thank you so much for that question. My friend Dan here made reference to TMT 30-meter telescope, which of course is top of mind for everyone. Mauna Kea is, depending on how you look at it, very sacred or very spiritual. And from my perspective as a Native Hawaiian, as Dan said, a lot of this discord could have been eliminated. And it reverts back to George's question about land. As Native Hawaiians, we have no land that we can call our own. We have some lands that our ali'i, our nobility, left to us as ceded lands that were intended to provide homes for all Native Hawaiians. And as recently as 24 hours ago, before I left Hawaii, we are in our legislature trying to figure out how do we get Hawaiians on our native lands. Even with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, we have people who stay on the list for a homestead 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They never get their homestead lands. They pass away before it happens. And it made me think of recently, I was at another conference and an individual sat down next to us. And as you can imagine, Hawaii became a COVID-safe destination. So we have on Hawaii Island, we've counted 900 billionaires that have moved to the state of Hawaii. And one of them was recently at a conference with me, and he said, "Oh, I don't know why the community doesn't like me." And I said, "Because you built your McMansion on traditional lands and immediately put up a wall. And for generations, we have gone there to gather limo, seaweed and fish and so forth. And perhaps if you took your wall down, we would be more open to having you here." And his response was, "Well, perhaps you people," which is always one of my favorite phrases, "perhaps you people should learn that in order to succeed in life, you need to have money, and money can buy you what I have." And I said, "And perhaps you people should learn that to us Indigenous people, it's not transaction, it's a reciprocal relationship. And there is a fine line between the understanding of reciprocity and transaction, but there's a line nonetheless. And I think having that reciprocal understanding is very important. I will say on behalf of astronomers and what you said, Mark, about Pono, for those of you who don't know, Pono means balance and harmony. I will say that the astronomers that I have the privilege of working with actually contribute to the sustainability, including the perpetuation of Native Hawaiians. You all recognize Mauna Kea and Haleakala as very spiritual, very important places. And if not for the astronomers who have helped to take care of the land, to make sure there is no Opala up on the mountain, etc., it would be in a much worse position. And finally, I want to say, when it comes to climate change, I want to go back to what you said, Danielle, about repeat, repeat, repeat. We are storytelling people. Indigenous peoples are storytelling. And we keep telling our stories. And we're finally getting people to listen. We've repeated for generations. Don't build so close to the shoreline. Be careful what you take from the ocean at what times of the year you take, because they're regenerating themselves. They're breeding at that period of time. We've repeated enough that we're now seeing Western colonists take our storytelling and they're now becoming your policies and laws. So repeat, repeat. Mahalo.
Thank you. I want to end with Faumuina, so we'll have Dan give closing comments, including any recommendation you may have for the space traffic management community. We'll go to Faumuina after this.
I'm probably one of the few people who have read the astronomy decadal that just came out. I think it was just not recently. But in there, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but you did. Okay, well, you know, what's happening there is that they realize, the astronomy community realizes that their treatment of Indigenous people is wrong. But how do they go about correcting it? Okay. I see them saying, yes, it's abysmal. That's the actual word that they use. It's abysmal. Our treatment, the astronomy treatment to Indigenous people. How they go about correcting it is another story. So yeah, I don't know about closing comments, but you know, I just want the astronomy community to reach out to Indigenous people and work with us in the TMT protests and those kinds of things would not happen in Kip Peak, and you know, as an example. But in closing comments, then, you know, Indigenous people all over the world have the right to go into space. They have now, at the time to go into space that we are going into, we find increased conjunction events, collision events, the probability of collision keeps going up. We know we're going to have an increased launch rate. We know that that's going to be significant. We know that we're not going to have the key players from China and Russia that we need. We're going to have to figure out new ways of doing things, maybe a 5-4 solution that we talked about. We, as Indigenous people, we matter. We should be included, not excluded.
Thank you. We'll hear the final thoughts from our wonderful connection. And to Faumuina, you have the closing word. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. What was coming to my mind around that, and I think it's how do we give presence and weight to Indigenous thought leaders, to Indigenous people? And for me, what was really heartwarming when I first met Moderator is that he said, you know, and we all know just how amazing he is, and he was saying to, it was only he and I talking. He said, well, I want to hear from Faumuina. And I think Faumuina should ask the questions and we should hear more from her. And it really did, first of all, I could see the organizers going, what is happening? But then what happened then is that we were able to bring two, I guess if we think about it, two disciplines together. But then he allowed me to lead. And I think that's a powerful thing. And Indigenous people have been leading in space like exploration from Earth for centuries. And I think that, you know, if we think about that, we were already mapping the stars. We were already traveling, knowing that the stars were our guides. Way before, you know, the rest of civilization were doing that. And, you know, one of our great navigators went to NASA and they were grilling him on, you know, how did you know the Earth was round? And that simple observation that he had was, well, the sun is round, the moon is round, and I think this, where I live, must be round. And I think there's that sense of just, you know, this practicality and wisdom, pragmatism, the story sharing, passing on through generations, and not just waiting till people are older, like passing on through when people are children, embedding those values. So these values, one thing I do know is you can give people skills, you can't give them values. And that's what Indigenous bring to the table, are values that have sustained people and tradition and land for so long. And I think that's what we need to be listening to. That's what we need at the table.
Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be listening to you today. Faumuina, it's really a pleasure to meet you. Look forward to being with you in person in the future. Thank you for sharing your poetry, and thank you for connecting with us. We heard you so well. To Dan and to Jacqui, thank you. It's an honor to be physically here with you. Thank you for sharing. And thank you all for listening, and for all those online as well. We'll close now.